1980s and 90s marked a time of dramatic economic and political change in the United States. The growth of government spending on social welfare programs that had begun during Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration ground to a halt, as did the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, which had defined U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Second World War. The U.S. went to war for the first time since the end of the Vietnam War, this time in the deserts of the Persian Gulf. And for only the second time in U.S. history, a sitting president was impeached. As the 20th century ended, America remained a nation deeply divided. By 1980, after almost 20 years of dramatic social change, many Americans believed that the U.S. was growing weaker, morally, economically, and as a world power. They had seen America lose the war in Vietnam and watch President Nixon resign in disgrace. Many struggled to make do as runaway inflation had eaten into the purchasing power of their paychecks. To make matters worse, as the 1980 presidential election approached, the country watched helplessly as 66 Americans continued to be held hostage in Iran. Many Americans thought it was time for a change. Former California Governor Ronald Reagan emerged as the Republican candidate for president in 1980. A former Hollywood actor, Reagan knew how to use the media. He was charismatic in front of a camera, good-looking, polished, and articulate.
I accept your nomination for the presidency of the United States.
Reagan was a political conservative, the most conservative Republican to run for president since Barry Goldwater lost to President Lyndon Johnson in the election of 1964. Reagan believed in a sharply reduced role for the federal government. He opposed most government social welfare programs, contending that personal initiative was the key to an individual's success. Many of Reagan's supporters, among them blue-collar union members who had formed the backbone of the Democratic Party, were angry about the years of change in the U.S., a period that included an increase in illegal drug use, a rising crime rate, and the continuing youth rebellion. They agreed with Reagan's notions that a return to traditional values was needed, and that large-scale government programs and liberal court decisions were behind much of the social upheaval in the U.S.
The traditional constituency of the Democratic Party had been breaking down through the decade of the 70s, and Reagan would appeal to ethnic, white, working-class voters in a way that Republicans traditionally had not before.
Ronald Reagan's promise to strengthen America's military and his strong stand against the Soviet Union also appealed to many voters. The Soviets' invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 had brought relations between the United States and the Soviet Union to a standstill. Reagan was strongly opposed to communism in general and skeptical about any kind of meaningful relationship with the Soviet Union, which he referred to as the evil empire.
But I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Elected in a landslide over President Jimmy Carter, Reagan's ability to put across his ideas earned him the title, the Great Communicator. At a time when many Americans felt the country was in decline, Reagan brimmed with self-confidence, optimism, and a sense of humor, even after narrowly surviving an assassination attempt early in his first term. As president, Reagan moved quickly to implement his economic programs. To stimulate the economy, Reagan adopted a philosophy called supply-side economics, the theory that steep tax cuts, particularly for the wealthy, would encourage more saving and investment. It was also known as trickle-down prosperity. If businesses grew unhindered by high taxes, the theory went, wealth would trickle down to the people in lower tax brackets through the creation of new jobs. This policy came to be called Reaganomics. To combat high inflation, the Federal Reserve Board, an independent government agency that controls the supply of money in the U.S., began raising interest rates. The Federal Reserve's plan did help control inflation, but the economy slowed so much that by the early 1980s, America was experiencing the worst economic slowdown or recession since the Great Depression. By 1983, the economy began to recover and inflation and unemployment were under control. Reaganomics seemed to solve some major economic problems, but it caused another. The federal deficit grew dramatically. The government had slowed the growth of spending on social programs, but massive tax cuts combined with increased military expenditures meant the government was still spending more than it was taking in, and the government began to go deeper and deeper into debt. Despite the growing budget deficit, the economy continued to recover throughout Reagan's second term. Another way Reagan hoped to stimulate the economy was by cutting back government regulation of industry. With less regulation, Reagan believed, businesses could be more profitable. The Reagan administration focused much of its deregulation efforts on the transportation and banking industries. His administration also moved to cut back on environmental regulations, arguing that many of them were bad for the growth of business. President Reagan appointed 3 judges to the Supreme Court, including the first woman justice, Sandra Day O'Connor. He also appointed Justices Antonin Scalia and Anthony Kennedy, appointments that reflected Reagan's conservative philosophy. This marked the end of a long period of court decisions expanding individual liberties that had begun during Roosevelt's New Deal. Ronald Reagan's commitment to ending big government slowed the growth of government spending on programs like welfare and job training, while out-of-pocket expenses for Medicare recipients increased. In addition, the president drastically reduced direct federal aid to states and cities.
The major cities suffered under Reagan. They had become accustomed to large amounts of federal aid, and this was withdrawn. So to the extent that there was a crisis of the cities during the 1980s, this was exacerbated by Reagan's policies.
While the cuts affected almost everyone receiving government support, they fell most heavily on single women with children. The combination of a tax policy that generally favored wealthier Americans, high unemployment, and reduced federal welfare dollars led to a widening gap between rich and poor. At the same time, crime rates, which had begun to rise in the 70s, continued to climb, especially in America's inner cities. As drug use and drug dealing increased, President Reagan pushed for tougher federal drug laws, a policy that, when adopted by states across the country, led to a dramatic increase in the nation's prison population. A strong anti-communist, President Reagan was determined to confront, rather than to seek accommodation with, communism around the globe. Believing the U.S. was falling behind the Soviet Union militarily, he greatly increased defense spending. That frightened some Americans, who joined the nuclear freeze movement, calling for a halt in the growth of nuclear arms. They joined a huge protest in New York City in 1982.
Certainly, there were grounds for fears of nuclear war, or at least nuclear escalation. This was a period where stockpiles in the United States and the Soviet Union, as many critics argued, could blow up the world many times over.
Partly to diffuse that protest and partly to protect America from nuclear missiles, President Reagan proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, a system that was dubbed Star Wars, since it would be based partly in space.
I call upon the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
The theory was that SDI would intercept Russian missiles at various phases of their flight before they got to the United States. Critics of SDI cited the program as being too expensive, unworkable, and inappropriately extending the arms race into space. By the time Reagan left office in 1989, the Star Wars program had barely gotten off the ground. To prevent the spread of communism in Latin America, President Reagan sent U.S. troops to the island of Grenada to halt what he said was a Cuban-backed revolt. Despite a congressional ban, he also supported the Contras, rebels fighting a pro-communist government in Nicaragua. It was later revealed that money to fund the Contras had come from secret arms sales to Iran in an effort to secure the release of American hostages. The Iran-Contra affair, as the scandal became known, was the most serious political crisis of the Reagan presidency. Despite the damage to Reagan's public image from the Iran-Contra affair, his strong stand against communism remained popular with the American public. Visiting the divided city of Berlin in 1987, he challenged Soviet leader Gorbachev to strike a blow for peace.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
By the end of his presidency, it was clear that Reagan's stance against the Soviet Union was paying off. Many believed that his decision to dramatically increase defense spending hastened the collapse of the Soviet Union because it could not match U.S. spending. President Reagan began a conservative revolution almost as thorough as the liberal revolution launched 50 years earlier by President Roosevelt. He slowed the growth of the federal government, convincing many Americans that the government was not the answer to all of society's problems. Supporters pointed out that this policy of less government led to the creation of 118 million new jobs, although critics pointed to the increased gap between the rich and poor and the decline of the inner cities. Ronald Reagan's immense popularity helped his Vice President George Bush win the 1988 presidential race over former Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis. As former CIA chief, UN ambassador, and ambassador to China, George Bush was well versed in foreign policy. During the campaign, he promised to continue the conservative revolution that Reagan had begun. But without Reagan's persuasiveness, he was forced to battle a Democratic Congress over most of his agenda. Bush also promised to cut the federal deficit without raising taxes.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
A pledge that would ultimately come back to haunt him. Just 6 months after he was elected, George Bush had to abandon his no new taxes pledge in an attempt to reduce the massive federal deficit. The tax increase helped slow down an economy already showing signs of weakness. Businesses tried to cut costs by using fewer people to accomplish the same amount of work. Downsizing became a catchphrase for corporate layoffs. Another of Bush's priorities was to create an agreement ensuring free trade in North America. He pushed for the North American Free Trade Act, or NAFTA, an agreement with Mexico and Canada that would gradually do away with tariffs and other trade barriers among the three countries. Many economists believed that increasing trade with Mexico and Canada would create jobs and lower tariff barriers to American goods, while critics feared that it would lead to a loss of U.S. jobs. At the same time, the economy began to shift from manufacturing products such as cars and appliances to producing high-tech computers, software, information, and services. Along with the emergence of the Internet, these trends would revolutionize American education and business. Nevertheless, the economy remained sluggish. So, in 1992, Bush offered an economic revival plan. But when Congress attached an amendment raising taxes on the wealthy, Bush vetoed the bill. President Bush's biggest success came overseas when a United Nations coalition, led by the U.S., ended Iraqi President Saddam Hussein's illegal occupation of Kuwait in 1991. Kuwait, an oil-rich conservative Persian Gulf nation, had been attacked and occupied by Iraq in a dispute over oil rights. Seeing the invasion as a threat to the world's supply of oil, President Bush organized a large coalition of nations to oppose the invasion. When Saddam refused to leave Kuwait, the UN forces, including 500,000 U.S. military personnel, attacked Iraq. The Gulf War began with a month-long bombing campaign, followed by a 100-hour ground war that drove Iraqi troops out of Kuwait. George Bush was widely praised for his handling of the Persian Gulf War and his steady hand as the Soviet Union collapsed.
George Bush had won a major victory in terms of public relations in the Gulf War. On the other hand, the victory for his presidency that the Gulf War represented would not last.
Many Republicans felt betrayed by the president's reversal on his no new taxes pledge. And despite approval ratings of nearly 90% after the Gulf War, many Americans believed that Bush was out of touch with their everyday problems and blamed him for the poor state of the economy.
The economy would begin a kind of spiraling downturn in the late 1980s and would create the impression in the United States that Bush had been much more interested in foreign policy than what was going on at home.
The tendency of voters to judge a president based heavily on the state of the economy would limit the presidency of George Bush to one term. Former Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton's promise to revive the economy and to make the country work again won him the 1992 election with less than 50% of the vote. Clinton was helped by the presence of a popular third-party candidate, Ross Perot, a self-made Texas millionaire who won more than 20 million votes with a promise to balance the federal budget and end the massive federal deficit. Many believe Perot's strong showing cost Bush the election. Clinton was a self-proclaimed New Democrat. While he supported traditional Democratic ideas like government stimulation of the economy and big programs like national health care, he also favored some of the more traditional Republican views on issues of law and order, individual initiative, and welfare reform.
He decided that a strategy was necessary if the Democratic Party was to remain a majority party. And so he engaged in a process of splitting the differences between Democratic positions and Republican positions.
President Clinton promised to make affordable health insurance available to every working American. One of his first acts as president was to appoint his wife, Hillary Rodham Clinton, as head of his task force on health care reform. The program Mrs. Clinton presented would have been one of the largest government social programs since Social Security. Republicans objected, saying that big government wasn't the solution to the health care crisis. Many worried that national health insurance would deny Americans the right to pick their own doctor. As a result, the president's health care bill suffered a humiliating defeat. Backlash from the health care bill, as well as a big tax hike signed by the president in an effort to help balance the budget, resulted in a 1994 Republican landslide that swept both houses of Congress for the first time in 42 years. Conservative Republicans, led by Georgia Congressman Newt Gingrich, attacked Clinton's policies by drafting what they called a contract with America, promising to revive the kind of government President Reagan had championed. When President Clinton vetoed the Republican budget in late 1995, the two sides were at a stalemate, as Republicans refused to pass any temporary spending bills to keep the government running. As a result, many departments in the federal government were forced to shut down. Both sides blamed the other, But it was President Clinton who won the public relations battle when a majority of Americans blamed the Republican Congress for the impasse. This marked a bitter defeat for the Republicans' contract with America. A good example of President Clinton's New Democrat philosophy was his welfare reform bill. In 1996, Clinton signed a largely Republican bill that placed new restrictions on aid for dependent children, food stamps, and Medicaid. The new bill also put time limits on how long most people could receive welfare, as well as incentives to get them off of welfare and into the workforce.
Today, President Clinton is signing the Dole Welfare Bill. I'm glad he finally got around it. He vetoed it twice.
Ending the current welfare system had been a part of the Republican agenda for years, and fulfilling his campaign pledge to end welfare as we know it angered many of Clinton's Democratic constituents. After the '92 election, the U.S. economy began to turn around, and before the decade was over, the nation was in the midst of the longest economic expansion in American history. Many people also credited the work of Alan Greenspan, head of the Federal Reserve, who, through his skillful control of interest rates, kept inflation low while allowing the economy to continue to grow. In addition, American businesses invested heavily in new plants and equipment, which paid off in increased productivity. And for a while, the booming industry that grew up around the internet also helped the economy by providing new jobs and increased tax revenues. The favorable economic climate convinced more Americans than ever to own stocks, which, combined with the robust economy, produced an unprecedented boom in stock prices, particularly among the so-called dot-com companies. Despite his skill as a politician and the fact that he was re-elected in 1996, President Clinton had to weather a series of personal scandals during his time in office. The most serious involved his inappropriate involvement with a White House intern. He denied the relationship, but later was forced to admit that he had not been truthful. Bill Clinton became the first president in 131 years to be impeached by the House of Representatives and tried by the Senate. Ironically, Clinton's job approval ratings were higher than ever during the impeachment process. Public trust in Clinton himself, however, as well as in the presidential office in general, dropped dramatically. Nevertheless, the Senate acquitted Clinton on February 12, 1999, and he completed his second term. President Clinton presided over the strongest U.S. economy in 30 years. The combination of the two tax hikes by Presidents Bush and Clinton and a booming economy combined to produce 4 budget surpluses in a row, as well as a dramatic reduction in the federal deficit. But the economy took a downturn at the end of Clinton's presidency when the dot-com bubble burst and technology stocks tumbled from their high prices. In addition, President Clinton also changed the tone of the Democratic Party, creating a coalition of New Democrats that kept traditional Democratic commitments to social welfare while adopting more conservative fiscal measures. Despite Bill Clinton's middle-of-the-road position, political divisions between Republicans and Democrats became increasingly bitter and partisan. The presidential election of 2000 would prove to be a fitting symbol of the growing partisanship in the final 20 years of the 20th century. Throughout 2000, George W. Bush, the governor of Texas, campaigned on a platform of what he called compassionate conservatism against Vice President Al Gore, who hoped to step out of the shadow of Bill Clinton and create his own legacy. But after one of the closest presidential elections ever, no official winner had been declared. Following weeks of uncertainty, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a controversial decision that favored the Bush campaign. George W. Bush would be the nation's 43rd president, the first of the 21st century.